The IRMACS Centre is proud to present the SFU Fellows of the Royal Society of Canada Seminar Series. This bi-weekly series hosts 5 presentations per semester. For the spring 2013 semester, the presenters belong to the Departments of Economics, Physics, Humanities, and the Faculty of Education. Today's speaker is Dr. Paul Dutton from the Department of Humanities.
The Humanities Department is devoted to texts and their contexts from the ancient world, the medieval world, the early modern or Renaissance world, and the modern world. And so it has a philological bent to it, and often languages other than English. And Paul Dutton was there at the beginning, and having been at Simon Fraser for almost 30 years, he was the coordinator of the program when it was still a program, and has been a mainstay of the department since it became a department in 1999. I think we can say that Paul is a world authority on Charlemagne and on Carolingian culture, and he asked me to keep my introduction short, and so I'll stop there. Paul, you'll have to make your way down from the...
Well, I'm not showing you anything. I do it the old... and when I came in, I said, the only thing I need is a lectern. And the young fellow helping me said, well, what's that? And I explained that it was a wooden object on which you put your papers. And so I've got this newfangled thing, which we'll see. I'm sure it'll work too. So I've spent a lot of time over the years thinking about Plato, the Timaeus, and its reception in the Middle Ages. It's basically that I'm going to talk about today. I mean, catastrophe, contingency, chance, and randomness are all back as ways of making sense of a disordered, overpopulated, climactically challenged, asteroid-targeted world. Catastrophism has had its ups and downs as an important idea, although today we tend to be somewhat promiscuous in our use of words. Think of poor awesome, which was once a very majestic word, and you can't use it anymore because it's been so misused. Catastrophe, like cataclysm, should refer to utter failure. Calamity and disaster, I suppose, to sudden misfortunes, more limited in scope. The notion that Earth history and human history have been and will be radically changed by catastrophes has not always been a common conviction. The leading edge of 19th century thought slowly came to embrace the large, the slow, and steady transformation of the physical world, which we call uniformitarianism, or I suppose gradualism. And geologists and biologists showed the way. Led by the likes of Charles Lyell, geologists freed scientists from the idea that Earth had had a short history. Geological formations, after all, the slow elevation of mountains, the imperceptible erosion of rock, and the slow drift of continental masses all led to the recognition of a long geological calendar. In the animal world, Darwin worked from the same core idea, that it had taken a considerable amount of time for animal life to change by natural selection into the species that we presently see. Fossils were the hard proof of physical change and the vastness of time. Gradualism, not catastrophism, ruled the pre-21st century modern mind, and it was comforting. No unexpected shocks need be expected. Things would carry on pretty much the same as they always had, and steady improvement was sure to be the human future in a world that knew few abrupt changes. No wonder then that the catastrophists, the few that there were, left a bad odor in the mansion of modern thought. Immanuel Velikovsky in the 1950s was shunned for his extreme catastrophism, and not just for the pure wackiness of his ideas, among which were his claim that the planet Venus was a comet, and that various erratic movements of the inner planets had caused major Earth catastrophes, such as the biblical plagues, floods, and disappearance of the island continent of Atlantis. But catastrophism has roared back over the last 35 years. In 1980, the Alvarezes, father Walter and son Louis, proved to the satisfaction of most scientists that 65 million years ago, an asteroid the size of Mount Everest had struck the Earth off the Yucatan Peninsula, casting a layer of asteroid and Earth ash into the air that blocked solar rays, cooled the Earth, killed off the dinosaurs, and almost 75% of all life. It was a fine theory supported by a layer of iridium in sediment deposits around the world. 14 years later, the theory received just the visible proof that the less imaginative among us seem to need. Who of the right age, and I think everyone here is, who of the right age can forget the breathtaking collision of comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 with Jupiter in July 1994? As it approached the gas giant, the comet fragmented before slicing through Jupiter's soupy atmosphere, an effect that has still not stopped roiling Jupiter's weather. Our own less cosmically important disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, floods, sinkholes, and volcanic eruptions, we now read as portents of the world-changing catastrophe we've come to dread. We're all catastrophists today, or at least Hollywood is, even though rapid climate change should properly belong to the gradualist paradigm, since it will take centuries for it to play out. As always, Plato was there before us. He stirs our imaginations because his inventive mind so often visited basic ideas long before we did. When we do, we almost always think what a clever old Greek he was to have seen that first. Although he did not belabor the point, he and his sometime student Aristotle were convinced catastrophists. Plato thought that every so often the world was undone by global catastrophes, and few survivors were forced to start over again with only a faint memory, if any memory at all, of the deep past. His late dialogue, the Timaeus, is a strange book, for though its chief subject is the origin and nature of the universe, it starts as the first work of an unfulfilled trilogy of books. Socrates begins the conversation with the trilogy's principal speakers, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates. Critias regales the three others with an account of deep history, one now utterly forgotten by the Greeks. Some 9,000 years before, he said, there'd been glorious Greek deeds, which, and I quote, have been forgotten through the lapse of time and the destruction of human life. The Greeks now possess no knowledge hoary with age. There have been, he says, and will be hereafter many diverse destructions of mankind, the greatest by fire and water. How was Critias able to fill in that lost history? Solon, he told the others, had visited Egypt and met priests who regarded the Greeks as children since they'd lost their memory of ancient things and were forced to start over. But in Egypt, old documents had not suffered the same destruction by flood or fire. That story Solon told to the great-grandfather of Critias, who told it to his grandfather, who told it to him, and now he to Socrates, Timaeus, and Hermocrates. Among the things the younger Critias heard was the story of the island continent of Atlantis and of its destruction in the great Western Sea. In a surviving fragment of the second dialogue of the trilogy, the Critias, Critias examines the society of Atlantis, which seems remarkably like Plato's imagined republic. In the Statesman and the Laws, Plato had already set out his conviction that periodic catastrophes of floods, pestilence, and other sorts struck humankind and left only a few survivors behind to begin again. Only mountain peoples would have survived great inundations. Lowland cities would have all been swept away, and the memory and traces of these people and their history would have disappeared. Fire would even things out by unmaking the mountain peoples. In some cosmic crises, God chose to rewind the universe in order to start it up again. At the moment when the world rolls over, God reverses the flow of time so that the old man slowly grows backwards, his gray hair turning black again, youth returning, childhood coming on, and then infancy. So you see, Plato was there before F. Scott Fitzgerald and Brad Pitt retold the story as the curious case of Benjamin Button. Plato's own science fiction fantasy suggests something else, a belief in the cyclical nature of time, which could run both backwards and forwards according to the cosmic will. The notion of cyclical time came easily to the Greeks, since it comported well with what they saw. The year seems to start again each spring, and the cosmos operates in a great year of 25,000 plus years when the constellations return to their original starting point as seen from Earth. An idea of cyclical time, however, is less easy to defend philosophically than one of linear time. So even Plato and Aristotle may have viewed cyclical time as episodic, as kind of circles on a line, and not one big circle of great recurrence. Because after all, if that endless circle of recurrence were true, I myself would be somewhat disappointed to think that at some point in cyclical time, we'd be gathered here again for you to listen to my lecture, or a second time, or perhaps a 200th time. Now, there is a way to break out of that cyclical horror, and it would be for me not to give the paper in the first place, but it's too late for that, so I'm sorry. But I think Plato's wrong anyway. Aristotle's catastrophism came by way of Plato and the Timaeus. For the story he tells of Egypt, great floods, and catastrophes is in part his master's. But as so often, Aristotle modifies the theory and wants the science of the thing to be right. And in general, he seems a gradualist. His earth physics depends upon the sea and the land working against each other slowly over time and beyond human observation, because it exceeds the span of a human life. But these changes are so slow for Aristotle in the main. He does allow for sudden mammoth catastrophes, but he tends to downplay them. So I think if you had Aristotle here and you asked him, he would say, yes, both are at work. General gradualism changing the earth, but also sudden misfortunes or disasters that can do the same more suddenly. Of the destruction of the island continent of Atlantis, Aristotle has nothing to say. Few readers in Greece or Rome paid any particular attention to Plato's Atlantis story, nor did they much comment on his catastrophism, either because they shared his view of the deep and mysterious history of the world, or knew that he was speaking imaginatively and not literally. They understood the story of Atlantis to be a myth, not the history of an actual event. Proclus, the Greek commentator of the Timaeus, said that Crantor, the author of an earlier and now lost commentary on the dialogue, said that Plato's peers used to kid him, saying that he'd not really invented his republic, but copied Egyptian institutions. To acknowledge that he got the joke, I think, Plato inserted his fabulous story at the start of the Timaeus. But if the ancients were lukewarm to Plato's catastrophism and his Atlantis tale, what I want to know is why the European Middle Ages paid so little attention to Plato's catastrophism. And the Middle Ages was not a period interested in catastrophism at all. The Middle Ages knew a host of civilization-ending calamities, the fall of Rome, invasions, countless wars, the bubonic plague, but never formulated a clear doctrine of catastrophes. The surprising thing is that the Timaeus was the only book of the much-admired Plato that Western Europeans knew for most of the Middle Ages. Both Cicero and Chalcidius had translated portions of it into Latin. Cicero's translation, which is the better translation, but it's too brief and it's not complete, and it was ignored throughout the Middle Ages, whereas Chalcidius's translation, which is longer, more of the dialogue is translated, fuller, and he provides a commentary which is in its surviving part, is 6 times as long as the Timaeus on which it comments. In that extensive commentary, Chalcidius does not take up Critias's account of early Greeks and world history, does not speak of catastrophism, and never mentions Atlantis. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, medieval schoolmen had begun to take the Timaeus very seriously, teaching, glossing, and commenting on the whole work. So what did they think of Plato's catastrophism? As it turns out, not very much. Or rather, they failed to recognize and engage the doctrine of catastrophism, or even the example of the destruction of Atlantis. The systematic glossators and commentators among them did need to comment on Plato's translated words. That's what a systematic gloss is. It goes through and it comments on everything. So they needed to comment on it, but they were, and they'd been sharply interested in various points in the introduction to the Timaeus. The talk of an ideal city, the education of the young, and Socrates' startling suggestion that women should be held in common. This outraged them. Bernard of Chartres in the early 12th century was so shocked by Socrates' idea of sharing women. He ultimately recovers. What Bernard of Chartres comes up with is he says, if Socrates truly said that women should be held in common, then I can't agree with him. But I don't believe that's what he really meant. And so they give a kind of different sort of explanation for what Socrates was really trying to say. The community of man. You treat all women as your sisters, that kind of thing, which isn't what Socrates meant at all, of course. Socrates was, after all, revered as the philosophical father of ethics and morality by Christian thinkers. Plato's notion of the impact of catastrophes, however, produced no excited defense or repair by the commentators. The medieval readers of the Timaeus responded to its introductory material in a dutiful way, but were neither inspired nor alarmed by its catastrophism. Their collective treatment of the introductory speech of Critias can be reduced to three chief areas: matters mythological, matters chronological, and matters geographical. Because Critias supplied mythological information, they collected it. They were also interested in sorting out the chronology both of the story, who gave it to whom, when, and were struck by the news that the events described went back 9,000 years, though they didn't yet live under that hard Catholic doctrine that the world had begun in 4004 BCE. That's thanks to James Ussher, the Irishman. As to the island continent of Atlantis, they noted its placement in the west beyond the gates of Hercules, but were almost completely uninterested in its disappearance. One has to wonder why, if they took Plato seriously, and many of them did, that they didn't seem bothered by Critias's account to find their own worldview shaken. For the implication of Plato's dialogue was that the world was not stable, history was unfixed, and time not as linear and progressive as they assumed. William of Conches, the most systematic of the 12th century glossators of the Timaeus, can serve as our guide to the problem. First, William was convinced that what Critias had to say was an extraordinary thing and therefore less than certain. It was a kind of one-off. And he characterized it, indeed much of William's treatment of the Critias is characterized by his commitment to play it straight, to try to understand Plato as well as he can, and Socrates' statements, and to claim that when Plato went out of bounds and said something unacceptable, that he was speaking metaphorically. They had a little catchphrase for this, either per involucrum or per integumentum, which is really under the cover and cloak of hidden truth, and so they would find the truth by interpreting it. He didn't have to, when it came to catastrophism, to resort to these techniques of accommodation and avoidance, because he wasn't all that troubled by Critias' speech. Since much of the story concerned ancient Greek history, well before recorded history, it already lay in the land of myth and metaphor, and didn't need to be taken at face value. When it came to the doctrine of the catastrophic upsetting of the world, William turned to an examination of the physics of climate change, best explained by God's fundamental organization of things at creation. William was keen, however, to resolve one worrisome issue. It's only real doubt he has in his long interpretation of this opening speech in the Timaeus. This was the potential for a never-ending series of world floods. Of the Egyptian report of a devastating flood that overwhelmed the Greeks and much of the world, William said, and I quote, "It should be noted that this is said of a regional flood, because no region is left unharmed by a universal flood. When he says that many floods had done much damage, it is not against what we read in Genesis, that God had commanded that he would not send floodwaters over the earth again. God spoke of a universal flood, not of regional ones, for there have been many regional floods, as Augustine relates. Of Atlantis and its destruction, William supplies the standard geographical location of the island continent, but spends no time commenting on its sudden destruction. Nonetheless, William comes nearer than any other medieval commentator I can find to recognizing the problem presented by Plato's catastrophism to the accepted Christian understanding of the created world and time. But it's still not very close, and didn't lead him to doubt the assumed design of the way the world worked or the progress of time. The Middle Ages it accepted the Bible's basic teaching that there have been three great catastrophes in human history, all related early in Genesis. The expulsion of humankind from paradise for the sin of pride. Okay, well that happens once. Second, Noah's flood, when God was so perturbed by the wickedness of men and the world that he created that he decided to end it all, but saw in Noah one good and worthy man, fit to save, along with his family and representatives of animal life. And the third big catastrophe in the past was actually the incident of the Tower of Babel, when God was so dismayed by the pride of men that he stopped their erection of the great tower by linguistically dividing humans so that they couldn't understand each other and therefore not engage in such monumental and prideful acts. From God's point of view, humans had provoked each of these early catastrophes of development. For humans, it meant that they had to start over again, punished, diminished, and divided. But in his covenant with Noah, God had committed to never bringing disasters such as a world flood down on the chosen people again if they remained true to him. One explanation then for the medieval failure to take seriously or worry about Plato's doctrine of catastrophes was that they believed that they had a truer and better authority in the Bible. God sent catastrophes that all happened early in human history as God adjusted his first draft of creation and reset its direction. The medieval view of time was not that playful, Platonic one. It was linear, beginning with divine creation and moving toward the end of time. And so the medieval mind was not much interested in ideas of cyclical history. Time flowed forward to a finite end in apocalypse. Medieval men and women were properly apocalyptic, not catastrophic. And there's a big difference between the two. Yes, lots of terrible stuff has happened and will continue to happen, but these were, as both Augustine and William of Conches recognized, only regional or particular calamities, not universal catastrophes. There were no global do-overs in the medieval worldview. As such, they regarded disregarded in general the case of Atlantis. The commentators were mildly interested in its supposed location, but in general regarded it as just another example of Plato's storytelling. No one made a fuss about Atlantis in the entire Middle Ages. No one. The obsession with it, the conviction that it was a real place, and efforts to locate its ruins are an entirely early modern and modern madness that dates from after 1492. Lost Atlantis served as a conceptual bridge to the Americas. After all, both medieval and Renaissance men and women were authority-bound. The popular paradigm is that the Italian Renaissance freed the Middle Ages, from its slavish dependence on biblical and church authority, when in fact what Renaissance humanism really did was to erect another authority alongside it, and that in the form of classical learning. Consider the case of the Canary Islands off the western coast of Africa. Although they'd been slightly known in antiquity, just very vaguely known in antiquity, 14th century Italians were not sure what to make of them and their people when they were encountered by Europeans in 1341. Why did neither the Bible nor ancient authorities talk about the Canaries? Why did they know nothing about the Canaries? God's omniscient, after all. The Canaries should be a known feature. Both Petrarch and Boccaccio wrote with some surprise about these unknown and unaccounted for lands and their resident people, in part because how could there be anything outside of God's knowledge as revealed in the Bible or beyond the comprehensive knowledge of the ancients? Columbus's accidental landing in the Americas in 1492 dramatically compounded the problem. He thought that he was on his way to a known place, Japan, and from there to India, which may have comforted him and his crew, but slowly it dawned over the next 20 years on Amerigo Vespucci and others that these were previously unknown lands, or were they? One possible answer, and at the same time a defense of ancient authority, was that the Americas were Plato's lost island continent. Other biblical possibilities could be cited as well, including the lost tribes of Israel being the Mayans or something like that. There are all sorts of theories like that. But those theories seem something of a stretch. The whiff of Atlantis permeates Thomas More's Utopia, which is an experiment with an ideal government influenced by Plato's Republic and located on an overseas island. More's fund may have been more Platonic in inspiration, but others took Atlantis seriously as a way to fit the unknown into the known. With the old authority systems creaking and threatening serious collapse, many saw Plato's Atlantis as the necessary connection to and explanation for the apparent existence of new knowledge and new geography. They were not so new after all. But the old authorities had come with a set of checks and balances, interpretive complexities, and caps that prevented thinkers from venturing too far off course. When authority lost its gold standard perfection, its internal filters to truth, people were cut loose to use and abuse it as they saw fit. The seekers after a real Atlantis, whether they found it in Thera, in the Mediterranean, Sweden, there's a big argument about Sweden being Atlantis after all, or the Americas, they accepted the real existence of Atlantis without taking the measure of Plato's playful and inventive mind or the nature of myth into consideration. The Middle Ages didn't make that mistake, but at the same time it was unable to engage with Plato's catastrophism. It just didn't translate very well into their different conceptual scheme of how the world worked. They were, for the most part, unworried by near total catastrophe, since God had promised that he was finished with such universal floods and mass destructions. The stopping and restarting of civilization just didn't make much sense in a linear story of human progress and the approaching end of linear time. We postmoderns may believe in the possibility of an accidental or human-caused end to our world, but ancient thought has not translated well into our time, and so some of us, without the textual wisdom to assess ancient authority, have taken the myth of Atlantis as true and go looking for the non-existence, or take biblical authority as the literal truth and go looking for Noah's Ark. Somewhere, I think, and I'm at an end, somewhere, I think, in the fiery Empyrean, Plato must be laughing uncontrollably, while beside him, I think, Aristotle sits by weeping. And William of Conches looks over it all and wonders what the heck is going on. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Dutton, for an awesome lecture, dare I say it, in the old sense and the new sense.
That's a well-used phrase.
I would like to invite the audience, whom I thank for coming, to ask questions on this excellent talk. Please use the microphone.
Thanks a lot. So biologists think of the pre-Darwinian time as being one where the Western society was very interested in catastrophes, because when they first found the fossils, they said, well, there must have been many floods, and Hutton and then after him Lyell were working very hard to prove gradualism, because it wasn't actually the idea that was out there. So you presented the 19th century. So what happened? You got the medievals who were happy because they wanted linear time. So what happened between 1492 and Darwin that produced, or do we have it wrong when we think that pre-Darwinian Western folks were really into catastrophes?
No, I think it's the late 18th and 19th centuries that reclaim gradualism, and so yes, Lyell and the others are working hard to do that. So they reclaim it, because the 16th and 17th centuries, I think, still thought catastrophism was possible. The Middle Ages wasn't interested in it. It had its own big catastrophe coming, but it could be viewed at the end of time, could be viewed in a variety of different ways. We're moving to another world, something's happening to us. So I think I haven't really explored the 16th and 17th centuries on catastrophism proper, but my impression is that it makes a comeback after the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages had kind of damped down some of that in general, but it was worth exploring further, because I started following Atlantis at a certain point in the lecture.
Would anybody else like to ask a question?
Anna's going to ask me a science question I can't possibly answer.
It's just a follow-up, actually, on the first question.
Yeah.
I mean, Darwin was a catastrophist as well as a gradualist, because he was very worried about the heat death of the universe. And I think a lot of 19th century people sort of caught on to that. And he was saying, well, what's going to be the end of evolution, says Darwin? It's a disaster. So he had this kind of, he had an idea of progress, even though most biologists would say he didn't. And the heat death was going to be the end of it. And there's a lot of correspondence of Darwin with his colleagues talking about just that.
I've got this here. But I was going to say, too, Victorians or the 19th century, the late 19th century, they also believe they suddenly realize that the sun is going to burn out, which affects them as well. That's a big catastrophe coming. I think in general in human history, gradualism and catastrophism are always probably present. It's just the balance or the emphasis. It's just the Middle Ages wasn't. What's shocking is the Middle Ages is utterly underinterested in catastrophism, that the human history can suddenly be overturned and start again. Yeah.
I was wondering if the concentration on belief in God and that everything is in God's hands, and there is nothing we can do about almost a fatalism aspect in the Middle Ages and medieval time period. Would that have affected their concept of catastrophism and gradualism, and whatever is going to happen is in God's hands, and there's not much we can do about it anyway?
Well, if you think of something like the bubonic plague, I mean, the old caricature was that in Islamic lands, which were hit just as hard as Western Europe, there was a general fatalism. And we can find a few people in Islamic lands saying that, well, it's God's plan, so we'll accept that we're going to die in this awful disease, and we'll be martyrs. There's some kind of talk like that. And yet they were still hiring doctors to help them, give them remedies to ward off this disease. In the West, there's a general sort of despair because they don't know what's happening. They've attributed it to various climatic irregularities, asteroids causing spheres, the planets in the wrong position. They do come up with various strategies for quarantining cities. Pisa, for instance, gets quarantined. Milan has quarantine measures. So they do. But in general, what were you going to do except that this thing was beyond, and the doctor's prescriptions were crazy. If you were rich, you were told to drink gold. If you were poor, you were told to eat garlic. So the remedies were lousy as well. I think in general the Middle Ages is not fatalistic in that sense. It's God's lack of interference in affairs that allows humans to act. And guys like William of Conches says, well, yes, God can do anything he wants, but after all, does he do anything that he wants? The peasants think that God can make a calf out of a tree trunk. And William says, okay, but has he ever done it? So that was William of Conches' attitude in general. If God wants to make his presence known, he can do it. He can do whatever he wants. But in the meantime, let's carry on with what we've observed, what we think is true. But he's an intellectual, and whether that was widespread or not. They just don't seem to have obsessed about the one conclusion you see in the Middle Ages. Every time a big problem comes along, like the bubonic plague, they say, this could be the end of time. They quickly run to that explanation. How it actually changes their behavior, it's hard to know, if it changes their behavior.
Do we have any other questions at all? It's excellent talk. Well, maybe we should thank the speaker again. I'd just like to personally thank Professor Dutton, and I'd like to thank all the speakers who, in the Royal Society of Canada series, who've spoken. We've had 20 of the 35, roughly, I think you said, members of the Royal Society of Canada or fellows of the Royal Society of Canada who've spoken, and I think it's been quite a success. I'd also, at the same time, like to give great thanks to Veso and Pam, Veso Jungic and Pam, who from IRMACS, and all the other excellent staff from IRMACS for having really done the organization. I was just the suggester, but the real work was done by them, and I'd like you to thank them with a nice. So I understand there'll be some refreshments. I also wanted to say that I hope the idea of this series was to give some, if you like, some vision to who the members of the Royal Society, who the fellows of the Royal Society at Simon Fraser are, and also I hope that if you have any idea of any other activities that the Royal Society could, the fellows of the Royal Society could be involved in. I was thinking perhaps of some interesting series of seminars or some blending of ideas where one could perhaps have a workshop or something like that. Please let me know, or please let Vessel know, and we'll see what we can do. Thank you.